My water broke in the car, and he told me to get out. There are moments that compress a lifetime into the width of a heartbeat. I remember the heat of the upholstery against my back, the suitcase at my feet, and the ridiculous way the sun caught on the small scratches along the dashboard. I remember the smell of his aftershave mixing with the stale coffee cup in the cup holder. I remember the sudden wetness spreading beneath me, cool and shocking, and the word I said out loud like a question. "Oh." David glanced over without much expression. His parents were in the front seat, chatting about the route like everything was normal. Their vacation had been planned for weeks. A week at the coast, the kind of thing his mother loved with a rigor that always seemed to pass judgment as affection. We had argued about the timing before, like we always did when anything touched the perimeter of our small shared life, his plans versus my comfort. He insisted it was fine. He said, "We'll be close. It's not a big deal." He said it without panic, without real concern, in the tone he used when he was telling me something inconvenient rather than alarming. I felt the wetness and then the panic, the quick map of every worst-case scenario flashing. My phone slipped under my thigh. I could hear the faint rustle of fabric. My body wanted one thing, and my voice, brittle and small, wanted to give it score. "David, I think my water just broke." He didn't turn. He didn't touch me. He said, in a voice that had the same distance he'd carried for years now, "Get out." Those two words are still small, sharp, like the click of a lock. Get out. He rolled down the window barely wide enough for the air to move, as if the breeze might fix this. His parents didn't look back. They were already talking about the weather and the timing, as if nothing had shifted. I had not expected this to be the moment everything pointed to. We had been sliding for months, years if I was honest, across a surface of neglect that we both pretended was just how marriage is sometimes. But to be told to get out of a car while you are leaking, in labor, with a bag of other people's sunscreen and towels rattling in the trunk, felt like being thrown into a public kind of smallness. It wasn't dramatic. It was efficient. It was final. If you want to know how this ended, stay with me. When people ask me now, in the reticent way people who haven't lived these years gently prod, whether I'd seen it coming, I say yes and no. There were signs, small ruptures, the steady drip of indifference, and some of them I've kept in a kind of mental drawer next to the receipts from the early dates, things I sometimes pull open to remind myself that I didn't imagine the good parts. But there were also moments I missed, moments where I either excused his behavior or chalked it up to stress, late nights, or my own faltering nerves as the due date loomed. He never hit me. He never screamed. He eroded me in the way water erodes stone, slowly, in ways that are hard to attribute to one wave. The beer incident was a simple example, but ordinary details are the thing that finally made up the whole. One evening, about 3 months before, he came home with a six-pack and expected me to smile. I'd spent the day on my feet, nesting the house, putting together the nursery, writing half a blog post during nap time, the small ways I tried to make our life better, to make things easier. He opened a beer, sat on the couch, and watched a show he'd already seen 3 times. When dinner was ready, he complained about the salt, and then, when I asked if he could help with the dishes, said, "I had a long day." He looked at me the way a man looks at a window he can close. Later that week, he used my failure to meet some invisible standard as a lesson for his mother. "She's great at this kind of thing," he told me once, as if his mother's competence was a weapon disguised as praise. That comparison pierced in a way I hadn't expected. It made me small in my own house. His mother was practical, yes, but she was also unasked for. She was a standard that hovered between us like a third person at the table. There were other moments that knitted together. The time he came home drunk and slept in the hallway because he'd decided he would sleep where he felt like sleeping, leaving me to navigate the night with a swollen ankle and a pillow pressed to my ribs. The night he criticized a crock-pot dinner I'd been trying for weeks because it tasted like stew, as if stew were an insult. The small refusal to help with appointments, with phone calls, with anything that might have been the labor of love that actually forms a partnership. Those were the years of my pregnancy, where other people's advice came in as bright, clumsy promises. "You'll forget everything when you meet the baby," they said. I wanted to believe them, but forget doesn't mean the disappearance of patterns. It means the moment when a new life is added to the ledger, and the old entries either count for something or keep hurting. We had talked about the trip. He loved his parents in a way that made me feel like a guest in my own life. They were helpful sometimes in the early months, making dinners, sending small, practical gifts. But there was a constant undercurrent of them seeing me as an auxiliary, an appendage to their son. They meant well. I understood that. But intentions don't rearrange the responsibilities of partnership. They don't fold the laundry or schedule a doctor's appointment or notice when the baby kicks early in the morning. The flight was only 2 days past my due date. 2 days. Maybe that sounds reckless. Maybe it was. I weighed the options, talked to my midwife, indefinido, at the level of specifics here, so I won't claim exact medical conversations. And I kept hearing a voice inside that said, if anything happens, they'll be close. David kept promising, in the casual tone of someone offering a contingency plan rather than a commitment, that they'd be only an hour away. He said they'd be very careful, that we'd take it slow, that this was important for his parents, the sort of things you say when you're aligning yourself with someone else's calendar, rather than with the person in the passenger seat, trying to breathe through tightened contractions. On the morning we left, I had packed a small hospital bag and put it within reach. I layered my clothes for comfort. I tucked my phone charger near the opening of my purse. We left before dawn. The car smelled of fabric softener and someone else's optimism. David's parents were already in their usual brisk, efficient mode. A travel choreography, they ran with the kind of cohesion people build when they have decades of family rituals. I felt like a side character in their choreography. The first few miles were quiet. Then there was a pop and a wetness that didn't make me think of anything other than the human body doing exactly what it's meant to do if you give it the space. I felt a rush of fear, and then an odd, separate sense of absurdity, like life was insisting on its own timing despite our plans. I called the midwife's office with trembling hands, and they told me to get to the nearest hospital. David's voice stayed flat. He instructed me to stay seated and said he'd call ahead. He said he'd make a few stops first, to fill the gas tank, to pick up some forgotten sunscreen. He said his parents had insisted on stopping for a coffee. He waved his hand as if that would make the contractions quieter. When he told me to get out of the car, it was not in a whisper. It was not in a rush to protect me. It was a brisk, administrative command. "Get out," he said. I remember thinking how much power there is in an imperative when you are the one who needs help. I remember the bucket of questions that pressed at the corner of my throat. Was this a fight? Was this a test? Was he scared? Or was he showing me how he would act when it mattered? I tried to register his face for a long, slow second. There was no panic in it, only a busy internal logic that had decided the trip was more important than the moment. His mother reached back once, a halfway glance that betrayed nothing. His father pretended to be checking directions. They were all moving forward as if this was a minor inconvenience to be outrun. I stepped out because I had no other practical move. The door closed on the world that had been my marriage as if it were an act of punctuation. My shoes were slick with warmth and embarrassment. The pavement felt absurdly solid beneath my feet. I was in the middle of a snack shop parking lot with other people milling past, their lives continuing like the thread that had not snapped. The wetness ran down, and I found a towel in the trunk, hands fumbling for a towel that smelled like sunscreen and car wax, and the odd perfume of someone else's toiletries. I had my bag. I had my phone. I had contractions that made my whole body fall into a different rhythm, and I had, for company, a taillight disappearing around the bend with my husband and his parents inside it, as if they were a single organism leaving me like dead weight. Are you okay?" a voice said from the doorway of a house across the street. It was Sarah. She was our neighbor 2 doors down, the kind of person who keeps a kettle on the boil and leaves jars of homemade jam on the stoop when someone is sick. She had been the person I leaned on when we first moved in, the one who brought over a casserole after my first miscarriage, the one who admired my attempts at a herb garden. She was smaller than me, and steady in a way that made me want to be steady too. She didn't ask if I needed help like it was a hypothetical. She moved. Her feet were in flip-flops. Her hair was pulled back. She wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders, not letting me decline. She knelt without being asked and said, with the kind of blunt tenderness that becomes a kind of religion in crises, "We are going to get you to the hospital. Now." Sarah put her arm around me and pressed her phone into my hand. "Call your mom," she said. "Call the midwife. I'll drive. Come on." I wanted to be furious. I was furious. I also felt a relief so immediate it made me dizzy. Someone was responding the way a person is supposed to respond. Present, willing, active. She didn't ask why. She didn't interrogate. She simply moved the situation into the space where it could be fixed. Her car was a small sedan with a sun-faded sticker on the bumper. She drove like someone who knew the neighborhood intimately, a speed that seemed both confident and careful. She reached for my hand once, squeezed it, and set me down into the passenger seat as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. In the rearview mirror, I could see our house a line of memory, the taillight already gone. The drive to the hospital was a series of contractions and small instructions. Sarah's voice, the cadence of a woman who had mothered other people's children in the informal way neighbors do, was pragmatic. Breathe through it. Think about the sound of a wave. In for 4, out for 6. She spoke with the kind of calm that arrives from seeing life and death in the grocery aisle, from being present in other people's storms. I clung to the breath. The car smelled like lemon and the faint hum of an old radio. At triage, the nurse took one look at me and didn't ask many questions. She ushered me into a private room with the brisk kindness of someone who has been entrusted with the small machinery of childbirth dozens, hundreds of times. They asked my name, my due date. They felt my belly in a way that was both professional and tender. Sarah stayed in the corner of the room like a guardian, smoothing the blanket, wondering what beverage might calm me afterwards. She called my parents on speaker and said, "We're at the hospital. Lisa's here." My mother started to cry softly on the line, the kind of sound that had been both an alarm and a balm since childhood. During the early contractions, I drifted in and out of focus. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and the trace of coffee. I remember the midwife's voice. "You're doing great," she said in that steady, no-nonsense way that midwives acquire. There was a monitor, a strip of paper with the baby's heart. I watched the tiny line move like a pulse in a film. I thought, irrationally, of David in the car, of the clothes he'd chosen for himself, of the complacency in his face. I thought of our apartment and the way he left his socks in little piles like coins. My parents arrived in a blur of crying and motion. My father carried the overnight bag like someone who'd been preparing for war. My mother moved toward me and sat in a chair with a dignity that made me smaller and braver at the same time. She had always been the kind of mother who would cross oceans for her children, and that day she crossed the hospital corridor like a general. David called while I was in the room. My hands were slippery and I didn't answer. He texted, then called again. The messages were a blur on my phone, short, sharp, questions packaged as check-ins. There was a tone in them that alternated between irritation and performance, as if he had rehearsed a response that would look appropriate when read later. I put the phone face down. The birthing room had enough people in it to make a small arena. Sarah with her muted fury, my mother with her clinical calmness, my father with a strange, careful smile that tried to imagine himself in my shoes and failed. The midwife checked me and said it wasn't far now. There was a light pressure. A nurse adjusted the room and handed me a small cup of ice chips. I drank them as if they were a ritual. The labor moved in ways that are hard to describe because they are both primitive and private. There were noises, small and sharp, that didn't belong to me and then belonged too much. My body remembered ancestries. The baby moved. I said, with a voice that had been carved out of everything I'd been through, I want a birthing plan, and then let the word fall, because plans are funny things in labor. When the baby arrived, it was like being introduced to a new element. The first cry cut through the room with a clarity that made the whole universe rearrange. I remember the precise sound and the way it seemed to remove the taste of fear from my mouth. They placed the baby on my chest, and the world condensed to that warm, slippery weight, to the fragile sound that said, yes, we are here. My first reaction was not triumph or anger or even relief alone. It was vertigo, a dizzy feeling that my life had shifted under my feet while the world continued to play its soundtrack. I looked up and caught Sarah's face, and she was smiling in a way that made me feel like I belonged to a new tribe. My mother was weeping softly. My father made a joke that wasn't funny, but somehow eased the shoulders of everyone in the room. The midwife gave me a look of professional pride, the kind that says, "You made it. You did the thing." There was a dryness in my mouth, and somewhere between the wet linens and the fluorescent light, a small, fierce flame of anger lit up. I thought of the tail light leaving, of the smell of his aftershave, of his parents' quiet. I thought of the way he'd told me to get out. The thought wasn't the same as revenge. It was the clear, simple inventory of what had happened and what that moment meant for the future. He had chosen, in a luminous moment of his character, to prioritize convenience and routine over the person who had carried his child. That choice would need a response that protected me and the baby, I decided, one that prioritized stability and safety over public spectacle. I held the baby and felt protective, as if a program inside of me had shifted from negotiation to defense. I remember thinking, with a brutal kind of clarity, that the world would have to change around me because I would not make myself small again. That was the first seed of the resolve that would later grow into legal choices and emotional boundaries. For then, my priority was this small, warm thing and the person who had driven me to the hospital, Sarah, who never left my side. There was no cinematic shouting at the end of those first hours. There was only the practical business of new life, the nurse helping with breastfeeding positions, the midwife charting, the small anonymous rituals of postpartum care. David texted again. His message was short. "Are you okay?" A later message said, "I'm apologizing." But the apology arrived as a text, flattened like a stamp. It felt inadequate. He called a few times and then stopped. I didn't pick up. In the waiting room, the rational world tried to reassert itself. There were forms to sign, a baby registration, bracelets to match. My parents argued softly about car seats and schedules. Sarah sat nearby and drank a coffee she had gone to get, and then returned with trembling hands. Her husband called once and said he'd handle a few things. He called himself available at work, and in that moment, his availability felt like a form of currency. I remember a nurse who later explained, in the way that nurses explain things to the newly exhausted, with a mixture of kindness and brevity, that I should try to rest. Rest seemed like an impossible directive for a mind that was threading itself through fresh betrayal and new motherhood. I wanted to sleep and also to inventory every message, every photograph, every small piece of evidence that would form the map of the next months. I wanted a ledger that included the ugliness of the car, the refusal, the way he'd walked away. People came and went. The baby slept in the crook of my arm like a prop of the universe. I thought about naming, about the way names anchor people into story. I thought about the story I would tell the child in years to come, the honest version that avoided the performative cruelty of public humiliation and instead taught a version of truth, that some people may not show up and that other people will prove indispensable in the most unlikely ways. At one point, David finally called and left a voice message. I listened later, hands shaking, as if the audio were a relic from another life. His voice had an edge of panic now, of someone who had realized, after the fact, that his choices had consequences beyond inconvenience. He said he'd been scared. He said he didn't know how to handle it. He said he thought it would be okay. He said he'd turn around. Those sentences had the same ring as many of his previous half-promises: plausible, late, and unsatisfying. I didn't return the call. I didn't know what the call would mean. There was a small, stubborn calculus inside me. This was not about the apology. This was about whether or not I wanted to share my life with someone who left me in a parking lot while my body did something monumental. The decision felt larger than the immediate wound. It felt like a test of whether the future would be an iteration of the old pattern or a new life built around different people and different rules. Late that night, when the visitors had thinned and the baby slept with a rhythm like a small engine, I watched David's messages with a kind of clinical distance. It is odd to feel betrayed and also relieved. It is odder to be grateful for a neighbor's kindness while feeling your old life settle in the ashtray of memory. I thought about how the human heart can hold these contradictions: love for the child, anger at the father, gratitude for strangers who become family. If you are listening to this and have ever been present at a moment when someone chose themselves over you, I want you to know that the shock is real and the healing is possible. That sentence is not a balm, it's a fact. There is a difference between surviving a betrayal and resolving it into a new life. The first is endurance. The second is active making. That evening, with the fluorescent glow and the soft breath of a newborn, I felt the beginning of both. There is still more to tell. The story doesn't end in the hospital room. There are messages that were posted, conversations that spun out into the public, legal steps that I would later take with the help of my parents and a lawyer, and consequences that reached over the head of one man into the life of a company and into the social circles I moved in. There are moments of justice that are more boring and more meticulous than dramatic shows of revenge. There are also the quieter scenes where a neighbor's husband, a CEO who disliked moral theater, used his influence not out of spite, but because a friend needed a hand. For now, in the early hours, I promised myself something simple. I promised I would not be small again for the sake of his comfort. I promised I would protect this child and myself with the steady, unglamorous work that parenting requires. I promised I would accept help and allow new families to form where the old one had failed. My body was exhausted, but the resolve felt like a new kind of muscle. I rested the baby on my chest, closed my eyes, and tried to imagine the life we would carve out, one built from the strange mixture of fear and tenderness in that hospital room. I wanted a life where the people who loved us showed up in ways that sustained rather than demeaned. I wanted honesty. I wanted protection. I wanted simply for the future to be kinder than the past. Tomorrow the calls would start. Tomorrow the messages would become a river. There would be a moment when a video, recorded by someone who had witnessed the scene in the parking lot, would appear online. A short clip that would tick through people's feeds like a splinter. There would be strangers judging and sympathizing, and in that river my private wound would be exposed to the light. There would be a lawyer's voice and a spreadsheet of assets and custody discussions. There would be hard, boring paperwork that would feel like therapy because it forced me to name what I wanted and to keep it. But that night, wrapped in the small, rhythmic breaths of my child, I allowed myself to be held by the people who had chosen differently. Sarah slept in the chair beside me, chin on her knees, ready to steady me if the world shifted. My mother stayed in the next room, making a small, homemade meal in the hospital kitchenette. My father slept on the couch with a newspaper folded as a blanket. Outside, The city carried on, unaware, uninterested, but also mercifully indifferent. Inside, there was a new constellation forming around a small, luminous creature. And around that creature, and around me, there were women and men who had showed up without calculation. I think, even now, about how a single imperative, get out, can pivot the trajectory of a life. It revealed a truth about our marriage that I could have kept pretending away. It didn't feel like a moment of triumph so much as a point of clarity. Sometimes the cruel acts people do are the treasury of your freedom, because they show you exactly where the line is. Standing at the edge of that line, with a newborn warming my skin, I decided to cross over. If this resonated with you, and you'd like to follow the rest of the story, what happened when the clip surfaced, how the legal negotiations moved at a painfully slow pace, and how I found a new kind of family, like and subscribe, and leave a note below. Your support matters in small, practical ways. The morning after, the hospital room was quieter than I'd expected. The baby slept like a small machine that hummed and then paused. My mother dozed in the chair with one hand folded over her chest. I woke to my phone buzzing on the bedside table, a steady, insistent vibration that felt like the world trying to pull me back into its orbit. At first I ignored it. I wanted that thin, protected time where only breath and small feeding rituals mattered. Then my mother nudged me awake and said softly, "There are messages." Her voice carried more than curiosity. It carried the rustle of people starting to do the heavy, ordinary work of life, communicating, deciding, responding. The first clip arrived from a number I didn't know. It was short, maybe 8 seconds, the shaky kind of footage people take when something strange happens in a parking lot and they can't decide whether to be a witness or a voyeur. In it, in grainy, vertical video, a woman in a cardigan steadies another woman leaning against a car. There is a towel, a shoe peeking out, a car door ajar. The phone camera person pans to the taillight receding. A voice off-screen says, "What the hell? Did he just—" The audio was muffled. Faces were blurred by the camera's movement. Someone added a caption when they posted it. "Unbelievable. She left her in the parking lot." I remember feeling my stomach drop in a way I had felt before, the exact same vertigo that had announced labor. The clip began to circulate within hours. People called it what it was, abandonment. Others called it a spectacle. I clicked on it once because there is a strange, unavoidable math to seeing your life folded into a tiny online object. Curious, painful, clarifying. Seeing myself in that frame was surreal. I recognized the blue cardigan, the car's worn upholstery, the small towel with the sunscreen smell. I recognized the tilt of Sarah's head, the way she moved without astonishment, the steadiness that had felt like a lifeline. I didn't want to engage with the feeds. I put the phone face down and breathed. But news moves like water in small communities. A cousin texted. An old coworker messaged. A stranger wrote, "I don't know you, but I'm so sorry." The volume of other people's attention made the wound feel public, and at the same time the attention braided a sort of protection around me. Strangers offered rides, meals, advice. They sent messages saying they would testify to my character if it ever came to anything. They offered practical things I hadn't thought I needed. Car seats, a list of pediatricians, a recommendation for a postpartum doula. David's reaction vacillated between panic and performance. He texted apologies that read like statements of fault without consequence. "I didn't mean to. I panicked. I'm sorry." He called repeatedly, then stopped, then left voicemails that attempted to sound contrite and scared. When he realized the clip was circulating, his tone shifted. There was a frantic attempt at spin, the kind of clumsy PR people use when they suddenly understand that privacy is no longer the default. His parents, who had always treated anything that threatened their comfort as a logistical error rather than a moral problem, oscillated between embarrassment and defensiveness when I spoke to them through my mother. They made excuses, miscommunication, stress, that he had been afraid. Their words landed like small stones. I heard them, cataloged them, and set them aside. The pressure of public attention did not feel like victory. It felt like a mirror. When a friend showed me the comment threads, there were the expected waves: sympathy, anger, cruelty. A handful of voices accused me of exaggeration. Others offered support in ways that came with strings. Social media is an unruly, imperfect court. It is not justice. It is, at best, exposure. And exposure sometimes leads to accountability. Sarah's husband did something practical and quiet. He works in a capacity where he knows people, networks, and when he called someone at David's workplace and left a factual, calm message. There's a public clip going around. It's a personnel issue. It landed in the sort of place where companies take note. I will not name the business. It is not the point. The point is that institutions, when prompted, will act to protect themselves. His workplace reached out and said they had received a report and would investigate. That investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, David was on unpaid leave. Within a month, he lost his position. The ripple of that decision did not feel like mine to celebrate. It felt, instead, like a sobering consequence that matched the scale of what had happened. I remember when my father told me over the phone. He used the word consequence as if he were reading from a medical report. He didn't gloat. He rarely gloatingly enjoyed another person's misfortunes. He said simply, "You are safe now." Those two words, "safe now," had the weight of a verdict to them. I also remember the lawyer's office. My parents had recommended someone who could handle things quietly, my mother said, as if there were a genre of law for wounded daughters. We met with the lawyer in a small, sunlit office that smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The lawyer listened. She took notes without dramatics. She said things that were practical and steady, the kind of language that feels like scaffolding: timelines, documents, custody preferences, and what sorts of things courts often look for. She asked questions about habit. She asked about the parking lot incident, about the messages, about the voicemail where David said he was scared. She emphasized that decisions were mine to make. There was a recorded voicemail on my phone, one he had left while I was at the hospital. I had listened to it once and then forwarded it to the lawyer with a hand that didn't quite stop trembling. The lawyer said it would be useful. The way she said it, not triumphantly, but as a fact, made me feel oddly adult. Evidence is a strange thing. It is both cold and clarifying. It removes the fog of memory in a useful way. It tells a story in the language of record-keeping. We decided quietly to seek separation and to begin divorce proceedings. The lawyer spoke of mediation as a possibility, of creating parenting agreements that prioritize the baby. She explained, in the neutral way professionals have, that there would be forms and meetings and time. I nodded through some of it, allowed my parents to take care of logistics, and kept my focus on the baby. What I wanted, in the end, was simple: safety, stability, and the means to raise this child in a household where abandonment was not a living metaphor. As the legal work moved, so did the social fallout. David's messages turned more aggressive at times, not violent, but insistent, demanding access, threatening to make things difficult if I pursued what I wanted. I shared the worst of these with the lawyer who advised on boundaries and documentation. There is a strange humility in documenting pain. It feels like making a ledger of the ways your life has been mismanaged. It also feels like assembling a map of what you want to prevent in the future. His parents called my mother. Their voices were thin with shame. They asked if I would meet. My mother told them, gently but firmly, that the meeting would have to be arranged through legal counsel. Boundaries were new for them. They had previously been a kind of warm, unasked-for presence in our home. Now they were people who had watched their son choose convenience over care in a parking lot, and they were expected to reckon with what that meant. The months after the birth were a mixture of mundane tenderness and small, bureaucratic negotiations. I learned to fold a bassinet sheet without looking. I learned which lullaby soothed the baby fastest. I learned how to heat a bottle in the middle of the night without waking everyone in the house. I also learned to schedule calls with a lawyer, to sign documents, and to sit in rooms where people asked me to put my wants into words that could stand up in an office. There were harder nights. The grief didn't leave so much as it thinned. I missed the idea of the marriage I had hoped for, the dinners that would have included shared labor, the partner who would have ferried me to appointments without complaint. That grief felt like the residue of unrealized futures. But grief and resolve can coexist. I would cry for what I'd lost, then stand up and change a diaper. I would make a list of baby supplies, then circle the word security as if it were a thing you could buy in bulk. One of the quietest, most healing things that happened was how neighbors and friends began to knit around us. Sarah's presence continued. She was a constant that did not require explanation. Her husband would drop off casseroles or fix a shelf. My parents came over to help with laundry. A woman from a neighborhood group asked if she could come and read while I nursed, an offered hour of company so I wouldn't be alone with anxious thoughts. The new family that coalesced around us was not about replacing the old marriage. It was about distributing care. It was about choosing people who would show up. Employment for me required a careful recalibration. I had been writing part-time. I had a small corner of the internet where I wrote about domestic life, recipes, and, sometimes, the messier edges of motherhood. After the incident, readers left messages, some kind, some nosy, some heavy with suggestions. I realized that what I wanted to do with that space was to make it a place of honest reflection, not spectacle. I wrote about postpartum fatigue, about how to ask for help, about how isolation feels like a force. I did not write about the legal details. I wrote about the small facts of getting through a day. People wrote back. Some sent flowers. Some sent used baby clothes. The generosity was practical and humble, and it grounded me. When the papers were filed, the process was procedural and slow in the way of all official things. There were forms to fill, meetings to schedule, and conversations where we had to articulate what the child's life would look like. David at times attempted to negotiate from a place of late remorse. At other times, he tried to minimize. In one early exchange, he offered half-heartedly to help with expenses, as if money could fix the moral issue. I accepted nothing without consultation with my lawyer. I wanted the outcome to protect the child, not my ego. The settlement prioritized the baby's needs, custody terms that ensured stability, financial arrangements meant to support childcare and housing, and a division of property that was practical. None of it was poetic. None of it was revenge. It was a steady, administrative remaking of a life. Public attention faded in waves. There were moments when someone would resurface the clip, and the old torrent of comments would pick up like a tide. I learned to scroll past. At times, the baby would wake to my phone buzzing, and I would turn it off. At other times, messages would appear in my inbox. Gratitude from someone who had been in a worse place and was now building pockets of resilience because they had seen a life survive the small, public cruelty of abandonment. David retreated, first into the awkwardness of trying to maintain some kind of contact, then into a quieter life that clustered around his parents. The dynamics there were complex. They had always been a unit, a set of expectations and a choreography that made them comfortable. Now they were forced to negotiate the consequences of that comfort. There were calls between them that I did not overhear but imagined. Explanations, defenses, perhaps shame. I did not watch for his fall. I watched instead for the small markers of the life I was building. The way my child's laugh changed the shape of a morning. The way Sarah would bring over a dish and stay for 2 hours. The way my mother folded the laundry with a care that felt ritualistic and loving. There were moments, months later, when the baby reached small milestones, rolling over, a first giggle, a tentative crawl, and I felt a fierce private victory. These were not victories over David. They were victories over the inertia of grief, the gravitational pull of disappointment. They were demonstrations that life could be generous in the residue of pain. Friends joked that the baby had a whole village. The village came in different forms. Some were neighbors, some were friends from work, some were online correspondents who had become allies. Sarah's parents started to come by with platefuls of soup and recipes. Her husband, who had made that discreet call months earlier, became in his way a guardian of peace. He would appear at times with batteries for baby monitors or a small toolkit to fix a wobbly crib leg. These acts were not trophies to brandish. They were lifelines. There were hard conversations I chose to have too. I began therapy, not because I felt broken beyond repair, but because I wanted to learn the tools to hold myself steady. I learned about boundaries in practical terms, how to respond to a message, when to say no, how to ask for help without shame. Therapy gave language to the rusty mechanics of staying safe. I need, and I can't, and this is what I will accept. Saying these things aloud felt strange at first, like learning a new grammar. Over time, they became second nature. A year after the birth, we had a small celebration, a first birthday with balloons and a cake that read in clumsy icing, "You are loved." We invited Sarah and her family, my parents, and a handful of neighbors. David was not on the guest list. I am aware how deliberate that sentence reads. It is a boundary born of a long ledger of choices. The party was a collage of ordinary connection. Babies crawling on rugs, coffee cooling on saucers, a playlist of old songs my mother insisted on. The baby's laugh was like music everyone knows the words to. In the middle of that room, I felt an odd serenity. No explosive finale had been required for this sense of peace. It had arrived in the slow, consistent work of choosing who to allow close. People sometimes ask if the social consequences of that parking lot clip were fair. It's a complicated question. Fairness is not a single measure. For me, the clip's circulation meant safety, because it forced institutions and individuals to pay attention. It also forced me to navigate public scrutiny, which is its own kind of difficulty. I choose to see the consequence not as punishment, but as alignment. When a private wrong becomes public, institutions often respond to protect their reputations, and reputations are built on public expectation. I would not make exposure into a strategy. I would not recommend publicity as justice, but in my case, it broke an impasse. Time has a way of rearranging pain into something softer. It does not erase, it layers. There are still days when I catch myself tracing the memory of that taillight with my thumb, when I imagine how different furniture would feel if there were shared labor in our home. There are moments of waking at night when the old ache slides through. Those moments no longer dictate my day. They are part of the texture, not the pattern. I often think about what I would tell my child when they are old enough to ask. I want to tell them the truth in a way that protects them, that people sometimes disappoint, that not all adults behave as you hope, but that there are more people in the world who will show up than you may think. I want to teach them the names for the people who were steady, Sarah, her husband, my parents, and to build around them a language of gratitude and boundaries. Gratitude for the people who acted, and boundaries so that they recognize early what is acceptable and what is not. There is a small private irony that I keep to myself, that the night he chose to go on a trip instead of staying, I learned, finally and fiercely, who would build a different kind of family with me. That family was not made of vows and certificates, but of casseroles, calls in the middle of the night, fix-it visits, legal counsel, and the quiet solidity of someone who brings over soup and does not make a spectacle of their kindness. I will not pretend that everything is healed. There are legal loose ends, and there are days where the shadow of that imperative, "Get out," whispers like a cold draft. But I have found life in the margins of that phrase. I have taken it and built, deliberately, a life that resists being made small. What happened after that day was not a tidy arc of poetic justice. It was a long, steady process of reassembling a life from parts that had been scattered. There was help, a lot of paperwork, moments of social pain, and quiet acts of neighborliness that made all the difference. There were nights I sat in the dark, the baby sleeping, and allowed myself to be small and tired and afraid. There were mornings when I laughed so hard at something my child did that my face ached. There were conversations with my parents that were intense and honest and finally freeing. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away, it's this: betrayal, even in the most vivid moment, does not have to define you. It can be a pivot point. It can be proof. Not proof of your failure, but proof of someone else's limitations. That proof can be the basis for protection and change. I say that without triumph in my voice. There is no joy in cataloging another's failure. There is only clarity. The moment he left me in the car giving birth and went on a trip with his parents is the moment the illusion of our marriage's solidity dissolved. It was devastating. It was also clarifying. From that clarity, I built a life that cared for my child and protected the two of us. If this story landed with you in any way, please consider liking and subscribing. If you feel moved, leave a supportive comment rather than seeking out or harassing anyone involved. The kindness of strangers sustained me in ways I couldn't have imagined. Your words can do the same for someone else. And if you have a story to share it safely. There are spaces where we can listen without causing harm. Thank you for staying with me through this. The road was hard, and it continues to be a work in progress. But now, when I look at my child's face in the morning light, I know we are building something steady. A home where hands stay, where people choose to be present, and where the future will be kinder than the past.